Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Well, they are introducing vaccine passports in the European Union.
It shows or states whether the person has either been vaccinated or a recent negative test.
So if the UK can be included on that, could this be the answer for many of us getting away to the sunshine this summer? Or is it Cornwall all over again? Well, today, John Strickland tells us just how much the airline industry needs to make the most of the summer months.
But we need to have a summer because it's a time in which most cash would come in. It would normally be the most profitable time of year. And if we're lucky, we might only get perhaps half of it, if that, this year.
So we better get cracking on with those jabs, hadn't we? Plus, oil prices fell sharply yesterday. Why? Well, in part because of what Joe Biden has been saying about Vladimir Putin.
So you know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer?
I do.
Well, apparently the Russian leader doesn't like being called a killer very much. We'll look at the impact of all of that interview on the podcast today. It is Friday, the 19th of March, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's the business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Yes, the good news is the AstraZeneca vaccine is safe. The European Medical Agency has approved it and we can still keep taking it. That's the front page of the Daily Express today. Vaccine is safe and we're on track to freedom. Yes, still on target to exit lockdown by June the 21st, which is great news, particularly because I'm having the jab today. The Prime Minister had it yesterday. I thought I'd hang around, see what it's done to him. He's still around, I think, this morning, so I'm going to have mine this afternoon. Safe and effective, says the Metro. EU verdict on Oxford jab. The Daily Telegraph, most papers are leading with this morning. The jab is safe, which is, not really surprising news. So quite a boring day, really, in the papers. The jab is safe, says the Daily Telegraph. Yet the thing that isn't safe is catching COVID. Because they say there's been 5 cases of rare blood clots and 1 death reported in the UK. That is 0.09 deaths per million. Without it, of course, 126,000 people have died in the UK. But the French and the Germans, they needed further reassurance. I do not know. This is English. I'm not quite sure that was. Well, that was. I think it was supposed to be a French accent. So there we are. Even with such a massive quantum on those numbers, they still wanted reassurance from their medical agency. I don't think you need to be an epidemiologist to tell you this is going to work, do you? It comes from the land of the bleeding obvious. The Independent, Oxford vaccine safe, finds regulators. UK investigates clots, and we're not talking about the cabinet. But rollout will not be paused, they say. So most newspapers doing that. Some are also covering the fate of Nicola Sturgeon. Sturgeon in peril, says the Eye, with claims from an inquiry that she misled Parliament about her role in the botched government investigation into Alex Salmond. And when the inquiry's report is published next Tuesday, will she face a vote of no confidence, they ask, with a question mark. That's a question mark, just the one. Because there is according to the Daily Star, front page of the Daily Star, they devote the whole of the front page to this, an academic sacked for using too many aggressive question marks in his texts. Actually, I'm sorry, I should have read that. An academic sacked for using too many aggressive question marks in his texts? Huh? Has the world gone mad, they ask, with quadruple question marks. Still, there we are. A bit of light relief. It's cheap. It's only 55 pence. I mean, compare that to the others. I mean, you can't obviously compare it to other newspapers, but if you compare it to the Beano, that costs £2.75. So 55 pence is a good deal. That mentioned the Beano because Dennis the Menace turned 70 this week, by the way. I wonder if they've actually got Dennis the Menace in a Zimmer frame because the kids aren't buying the Beano, are they? I wish they were. I wish my kids would read the Beano so I could pick it up and read it as well. It's a bit sad if I go into a newsagent and try and get a copy myself, isn't it? But I wonder if they've got Dennis the Menace. Given that it's just us oldies now reading the Beano, surely they should have all the characters having moved on, Dennis the Menace with a Zimmer frame, putting fart cushions on the seats in the nursing home. Would anyone notice the difference? Triple question mark. Nobody really focusing on this, though, which was the big news on the other side of the English Channel yesterday.
What is the function of this certificate? It shows or states whether the person has either been vaccinated or a recent negative test or has recovered from COVID and thus antibodies. Secondly, the certificate will make sure that the results, or what it shows, the data, and the minimum set of data, are mutually recognized in every member state. And thirdly, with this digital certificate, we aim to help member states reinstate the freedom of movement in a safe, responsible and trusted manner.
Freedom of movement, do you remember that? Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission on the introduction of vaccine passports in the European Union. Digital green certificates, they're calling it. So that is for people travelling within the EU. What about people from the UK wanting to go to the EU this summer? You'd have to assume that they would be reticent to try and stop UK money flowing into European holiday resorts, wouldn't you? But you never know these days. Digital green certificates for people travelling within the EU. I wonder whether the UK will be successful in mustering their way into that programme. You've got to see the irony here, haven't you? I mean, we wanted an end to freedom of movement with Brexit, and Brexit was greeted with absolutely no freedom of movement for anyone anywhere. Almost as though there is a God watching over us, and he said to himself, look, if you want freedom of movement, let me show you what it's like for nobody to have it. Let me take it away from you. And then the freedom of movement was endeth for all. Maybe there is a God and he has a wicked sense of humour. But now the EU wants vaccine passports so they can have freedom of movement. And how long before we say, look, can we have some of that as well? The irony is just startling, isn't it? Certainly, I can't see Greece and Spain and Italy not wanting to allow British tourists to come in there this summer, because the tourist industry needs a summer, doesn't it, of lily-white Brits. Well, not all of us are white, obviously, but many of us are. They need us there to line their beaches and turn them beetroot red. The airline industry obviously needs this summer as well, and we know that the airline industry is one of the industries that's been hardest hit by the pandemic, according to the ATAG website. That's the Air Transport Action Group. If aviation was a country, it would be about the same size as the Netherlands. That's how much money it makes. Well, that was before. Anyway, obviously a lot less today. But data from the Civil Aviation Authority shows in January this year, passengers in all airports in the UK were down 81% on January last year. Take the whole of last year, which includes January and February, which were normal months. We didn't know what was coming down the line. Passenger numbers across the year, including those 2 good months, were 75% down. Some airports, like Newport and Cardiff, have been even worse off. Cardiff, for example, was getting less than 2% of its usual January passenger numbers this year. So how can an industry survive with such huge falls in revenue, particularly when it's gone on for so long, and particularly when nobody is precisely certain when it's all going to end? And what's going to change as well? Will we see less airlines, less routes, higher prices? Or will we conversely see new entrants coming into the market, keen to grab market share from those who have been struggling? Well, let's talk to John Strickland. He is an aviation analyst, a consultant. He's worked in the industry for getting on for 40 years. He specializes in network planning and revenue management and offers commercial strategy for airline operators through his company JLS Consulting. He's with us today. So, John, holiday companies are saying that they've seen a big increase in bookings since Boris Johnson announced his roadmap, and theoretically we'll be able to start again from May the 17th. But I'm assuming that few people in the industry are actually expecting that the summer of this year, summer of 2021, is going to be like the summer of 2019. I mean, numbers are still going to be way down, aren't they? Particularly, vaccines in the UK are being rolled out quickly, and we're getting on for half the population. But if you look at Europe, I mean, they're around the 3 to 4% mark, and in some cases, like Italy and Germany and Greece as well, we're actually seeing infection numbers rising again. We're seeing lockdowns as well in some places. So there's no guarantee that the summer holidays this year are going to happen at all for many people.
Well, of course, we hear about these big percentage increases in bookings, but on what basis? We're talking about very little traffic last year, so we can get these massive percentages, which actually mean very little. And we don't yet have an outcome of this government task force. I'm hearing rumours already that this date that's been trumpeted of May the 17th may, in fact, slip up. There's a lot of political concern about the new variants. Of course, we're seeing vaccine rollout slow down, not specifically here in the UK, although there seems to be this supply problem in April, but certainly all the other countries that are debating about the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Yeah.
So the industry is still in a very parlous state, and it's always been a case of jam tomorrow as this crisis has played out. Last year we had a bit of a fillip of demand in late summer, July, August, before it all fell away again. Then there was a hope that we'd get the Christmas traffic, and that didn't happen. Easter's only about 2 weeks away, and airlines have written that off. And mostly they've written off the early part of the summer, but we need to have a summer because it's the time in which most cash would come in. It would normally be the most profitable time of year. And if we're lucky, we might only get perhaps half of it, if that.
Yeah. Well, I was looking at the IAG group, which, of course, is the group that includes British Airways, last year, which obviously includes, as I said before, those 2 normal months, and their total revenue was down almost 70%. But they did manage to cut their costs by a third, but their loss for the year was about the same as their revenue for the year. So, and I think they're going to try and raise a bit of extra capital through a bond issuance. So it looks like they'll survive. Maybe the bigger airline groups will survive because they've managed to cut costs and they can raise a bit more capital afterwards. But are we going to see some airlines fall away as part of this?
Well, even at the top end, it's a very mixed picture. IAG is one of the better placed airline groups, and not only have they raised money, they've cut their costs in perhaps a more radical way more quickly. Because if you remember, British Airways, who was one of the airlines in that group, took a lot of flack last summer with this campaign, BA Betrayal, which was run by a couple of the airlines' union labour groups. I think they believed at the time it was a temporary problem. The airline was trying to get one over on them, so to speak, and impose more challenging working conditions. But I think the reality can be seen now that, yes, there have had to be much more difficult terms and conditions introduced, and indeed a large number of the workforce have lost their jobs entirely. But we can see this problem playing out over a long period of time. They had to do that to cut the cash drain. They haven't gone cap in hand to the government, not that the government would necessarily accede to that, other than the more general things such as the furlough scheme and export credit guarantee provisions. But we've seen other large airline groups like Lufthansa in Germany, Air France KLM in the Netherlands and France getting large injections of government money. But on the other hand, again, low-cost airlines like Ryanair, Wizz and EasyJet going out and finding their own funding, or indeed already having quite good funding already. But the government money that's around, in the case of some airlines, has shored up some capacity which otherwise would have gone. One good example where we see government funding likely to be continued is Alitalia, which is an airline that I tend to call the eternal phoenix of the industry, because ordinarily left to market forces, that airline would have gone in the past. And indeed, the biggest airline in Italy is Ryanair. But I think if we don't have this summer, as I mentioned, and revenue comes in sufficiently, then we could see more failures as we move into a second winter. And I'm sure we're going to have setbacks and spikes and new variants and stuff coming along.
The thing is, we just don't know, do we? So how do you plan? I mean, in your game, which is all about, as I said in the introduction, helping with network planning and revenue management, how do you? And I know it. I mean, it's been a bit of a precise science for airlines, hasn't it? Looking at the yield per plane that's taking off, and so you find you're getting the right mix of seats and all that sort of good stuff. That's micro level planning. I mean, you got no idea how you can't do any of that sort of thing.
This is the biggest challenge for airlines right now. All the data they've built up over many years and all the sophistication that they've been able to use to predict what kind of loads they would get on their flights, and therefore what kind of pricing levels they should apply, and indeed deciding where to fly. I've just been on some conference calls today with a couple of well-known airlines saying to me, well, we really can't see what is going on. Our planning horizons are not much more from 4 to 6 weeks ahead. We're seeing searches, but most customers are only looking 2 or 3 months ahead. And searches is not the same thing as booking. And deciding how much capacity we should put and where is a very high stakes, risky business, because if you don't put enough and demand comes through at the last minute, and one airline told me they have put capacity on at 24 hours notice, but you really can't count on that and you can't price it in an appropriate way. But you put on too much, and of course you have to take it off at the last minute when quarantines and border closures come in, and then get all the flack in terms of customer confidence and understandable dissatisfaction, but quite often paying out compensation for something you're doing not because you choose to do it, but because of this massive uncertainty and unpredictability.
Well, wouldn't you naturally say, well, okay, we're going to be very cautious and we're going to restrict flights, and if that means that people have to pay a higher price, then so be it. That's got to be a more profitable way forward for the airlines, hasn't it?
Well, it would be if you want to shrink your airline to a minuscule size. And if we think about the size of most airlines and divide into two, look at the global airlines flying a lot of long-haul flights. They rely on the premium-paying business-class customers. They've all gone away. They're going to have to reinvent their business models anyway on the basis of much lower average fares. But look at the other end of the scale, at the Ryanairs, the Wizzes, and the EasyJets. They sell on price. That is their raison d'etre. That's their modus operandi to get people on their planes. And they know if they don't offer low prices, they won't have those volumes. Now, EasyJet's got about 300 planes. Wizz has got about 130, and Ryanair's getting on for 500. That's a lot of capacity to fill. They're not filling it right now, but certainly they've been out there talking about using that price message even more when they're allowed to get flying again to kickstart the market and get people moving again. If you price too high, the market's going to shrink permanently.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, maybe, but I wonder whether people would be a bit understanding this year, and maybe there'd be an appetite to pay a bit more this year. But it's all a question of how much is a bit more.
Well, in some cases, on some routes, undoubtedly, there are people who've got money in their pocket and are desperate for holiday. But that doesn't mean that airlines can necessarily malevolently exploit that.
No.
They have to be careful.
All right. So, yeah, absolutely. So what shape was the airline industry in before all of this? Because, I mean, we saw stories like United Airlines, for example, doing massive share buybacks. So they must have been doing pretty well. I mean, on the face of it, it looks like the industry was doing okay before all of this.
Yes, I think the industry looked broadly like it had got to about the best place it had ever been. And a number of airline leaders had said, we've managed now to find a way of breaking out of the cyclical nature of business with enormous troughs and a few peaks and modest levels of profitability.
Famous last words.
Well, yeah, very prophetic that they did say such things. And as you say, companies, particularly in the US, have been heavily criticized for some of their share buybacks and dividends and executive bonuses, which maybe looked fine in those glory days a couple of years ago, but they certainly don't look fine now. And of course, we've seen even the strongest airlines, of course, cut their dividend payments for the foreseeable future. They have no other way to do it. But it doesn't gain them much sympathy with regulators or the public if they have that backdrop of behavior in the past against getting out of the begging bowl necessarily to raise liquidity now.
So who's going to be hurt the most out of this? Is it going to be the airlines? Is it going to be the aircraft manufacturers? Is it going to be the leasing companies? Is it going to be the airports? Who's going to feel the most hurt?
I think the airlines are the ones who have the hardest end of that. I mean, obviously the whole lot mixes together. There's a great interdependence because airports are nothing without airlines, and so too are manufacturers and suppliers, including all the components such as engine manufacturers and so on. But airlines are a start point. If they are enfeebled or they shrink, then they need less aircraft, they return aircraft or they cancel orders. If airports don't have the passengers that the airlines generate going through the terminals, they're not generating fees from user charges from the airlines, and they're certainly not generating all the money from retail revenues, which has become much more the important part of the model for airports in recent times. Airlines have long pushed for lower airport fees, so airports have used retail as a means to generate revenue. But if there are people not going through the airport, they're not getting the footfall. And in any case, what's going to happen in terms of that business model if we have social distancing still required, or indeed we're all a bit more reticent about scrumming around in airport crowds to peruse the duty-free shop or use one of the food and beverage outlets? I think there is going to be a need for a change in approach, different ways of generating revenues, much more use of technology, both in planning the business and in running the business and interfacing with customers, both for airlines and airports.
So what about business traffic? Because, I mean, I imagine that is going to be the real issue, isn't it? Because whereas leisure traffic, we know that will eventually bounce back. It might take a couple of years because we just don't know what's going to happen this year. But, I mean, there is a concern, isn't there, that, that revenue that airlines are seeing from the front end of the plane, I mean, we're zooming more, we're traveling less. The companies are saying, well, actually, this is going to be the new normal. I mean, that could change the whole shape of the industry, couldn't it? I saw an interview with, this was last year, in the middle of last year, with the CEO of Qatar Airways. He seemed to be suggesting that, well, maybe we'll look at one-class travel where everything is like premium economy because we're going to lose so much of that business traffic. Do you think airlines are going to have to look at the mix of the passengers and perhaps move more away from business?
Well, certainly those long-haul airlines for whom typically business traffic, business class traffic especially, is most important, where ticket prices may be higher by a ratio of 5 to 1 on an economy ticket. If they're not filling up those large business class cabins on routes like London, New York, or London, Asia, for example, then they're in a very difficult place. Their cost structures won't support long-term continuance of business unless they massively cut the costs or find other ways to fill those cabins. And I think we're going to see a combination of things happen. There will be maybe a new breed of traveller who is prepared to pay for business class for reasons of space, not just for the comfort of it, as in the past, but space to be away from people, have that sense of health, safety, and new leisure customers paying up for premium experience, but probably not up to the levels of pricing we've seen up until now. And I'm not a believer that all the travel will come back over time. I think now we're in a different place technologically with the ability to do these online meetings. If I think back to 9/11, which I remember clearly, I thought then demand for business travel had gone for good, but it came back. But we didn't have the ease of technology we have today. And the biggest elephant in the room, so to speak, is companies' attitudes about the environment. If companies want to show they are active as part of the green focus of the economy, what better to do than cut executive business travel and say, oh, we're doing it all online now. So I think airlines are kidding themselves if they think this restructure is not going to happen this time around. It's not a case of crying wolf. I think we're in a very different situation. And on the positive side, it's room for innovation and new thinking, but it certainly comes back to the cost base of operation for those airlines who depend on that travel. Again, low-cost airlines and short-haul travel is a bit different. There's less of that, and those airlines relying on visiting friends and relations travel and leisure are probably better placed if they can make money out of those lower margin customers because they're more dependable.
So you think that's going to bounce back quite quickly? But the jury's out on what long-haul travel is going to look like.
We've seen some of the leisure travel coming back already. When there's been a chance to travel, demand has come through, and when we hear that, we might be able to travel soon, airlines talk about spikes in bookings, but business travel hasn't suddenly picked up. I did just hear, interestingly, about within France, for example, domestically, the culture is such that people want to travel around face to face. So France, as one country, culturally, there's a greater imperative, especially for small businesses, to travel. But this, again, is not the well-heeled, long-haul, flatbed experience that we've known globally in the best airline business products.
All right. So finally, I mean, if this crisis diminishes, we're still left with that other one, aren't we? Which is climate change, which seems to be getting more and more attention now. And it's almost like this has been the canary in the coal mine, hasn't it? And people are looking more and more now at what's going to be the impact of climate change. And of course, the airline industry hasn't got a good track record in that, but it's getting better. And part of that is because of new aircraft, which is are much more fuel efficient. But could we see some of that being delayed because airlines are obviously trying to cut costs? Are they perhaps not going to be buying that new aircraft and they'll be using the old ones, which burn up more fuel?
I think actually the opposite. I think if anything, this crisis has expedited the industry's efforts to have good environmental and green credentials. One thing that happened almost in one fell swoop was the grounding and indeed permanent retiring of many older long-haul, large wide-bodied aircraft. The venerable 747, British Airways had a fleet of 32. They were grounded last summer, gone for good, at a stroke, which leaves BA with a fleet principally of very new twin-engine aircraft, which already burn less fuel and they have less capacity. So I think airlines will be looking to renew their fleets when they're in a state of health to do so with that type of aircraft. We see it in the orders. That's an immediate change. Of course, the low level of aviation activity right now is giving a benefit in simply there isn't the amount of flying taking place. But we need to see politicians engage with the industry, recognizing its essential catalytic role in the broadest sense with economies, whether it's with tourism, trade, cargo, and so on. It's not just a nice to have. And air traffic control systems, for example, in Europe, there's been an effort for about 30 years or so. Single European Sky is what it's called, to simplify air traffic control, allowing more direct flight routings, which can cut large amounts of time off flights, reduce all the circling around and waiting at holding points on the ground that we see at congested airports like Heathrow. That's been in a political logjam to move forward. It needs to be pushed now to come to a larger fruition than we've seen. And in terms of new technology, whether it is fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen power, electric power, these are big ticket expenses in terms of research, but they can be done, but they need to be sped up with active government involvement. Instead of governments putting taxes on tickets and just letting that all just disappear into some random pot, they need to put at least a big chunk of that back into investment so we can speed it up. If we think what we've done over the last year with vaccines, we didn't normally have vaccines developed in the space of a year. Yeah. Why shouldn't we rapidly speed up helping aviation to be a good citizen in the 21st century?
Yeah, well, I tell you, anybody who says now it's going to take 5 years to do something, we're just going to ignore them, aren't we? Because we've shown that if you put your mind to it, anything can be achieved in the space of 12 months. So absolutely, hear you on that one. So just to finish, I mean, we haven't seen any big names disappear in the airline industry. We have in the retail industry, for example, but airlines, I mean, we've seen some small, low-cost regional carriers perhaps have gone to the wall. Is the airline, by and large, going to make it through and survive?
I'm surprised we haven't seen more failures as yet, but I think part of it is that in some cases there have been these large chunks of government money coming in. The best members of the industry had already learned lessons in the last 10 to 15 years about careful management of cost, about building liquidity. That's what we see with the low-cost carriers. I've spoken in the last year with Joseph Varadi, for example, the chief executive of Wizz Air. He said he's always been surprised since he came into this industry, the lack of focus on cash preservation. He's very focused on it. Wizz Air's got about 2 years of liquidity. Michael O'Leary from Ryanair has told me before, the fact he grew up on a farm where winters were tough, he abhors debt. He's also managed financial resources very carefully at Ryanair. And Willie Walsh, previously at IAG, has done the same thing. So they have got through. They can demonstrate also to the markets that they are a good bet in terms of providing credit and liquidity. But as we discussed, I mean, if we don't have a good summer, which will bring money into the bank accounts of these airlines, then I think there are some who are on the edge of failing. And of course, we have seen massive capacity cuts from airlines as well, but it can't go on forever that way. There will be blood on the carpet at some point, I think, in the next 12 months.
Well, what you need is the ability for people to travel to Europe and a really bad summer in the UK. And that's going to be a nice fillip for the industry, isn't it? If it rains here for a few months, then everyone will be desperate to get away.
I'd like to do the trick.
Let's hope so. All right. Thanks so much, John. Now, if you look at the risk section of most airline annual reports in 2019, the risk of a global pandemic, it's barely mentioned. It's normally one word sort of thrown in the middle of a sentence along with other risks. That will change now, of course. It will be a very real risk for many companies and every company, really, not just in the airline industry, is going to have to manage its finances very differently from now on, not only just to get over the pandemic that we've just been through or we're still going through, but also to be ready for next time or ready for whatever else the world throws at it. Is it going to be climate change or whatever else is going to come out of the left field? I mean, no one knew that we were going to go through what we've been going through. Or maybe it's going to be whatever geopolitics throws on us. And on that, things are kicking off between the US and Russia. Are we on the verge of the next Cold War? Remember how the last president of the United States, you may have forgotten his name, Donald Trump, he never said anything bad against the Russians, almost as though they had something on him. But I don't think so. More likely, I think that Donald Trump just admired Vladimir Putin. He wanted to be more like him, but could never actually quite pull it off. Maybe he tried riding bareback on a horse with his shirt off. And even though he's the fittest president that ever lived, believe me, it's real. Maybe he just, when he saw the photos, it just didn't work. So it's a different story now, though. Joe Biden really doesn't care what he looks like on a horse. Probably couldn't get on a horse. And some of his words from a couple of days ago have escalated into what is becoming a major incident, I think. Here's Joe Biden being interviewed on ABC TV in the US by George Stephanopoulos.
Look, most important thing dealing with foreign leaders, in my experience, and I've dealt with an awful lot of them over my career, is just know the other guy.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
I do.
So what price must he pay?
He will pay a price. We had a long talk, he and I. I know him relatively well. And the conversation started off, I said, I know you and you know me. If I establish this occurred, then be prepared.
You said you know he doesn't have a soul.
Well, I did say that to him, yes. And his response was, we understand one another.
Well, maybe Joe Biden saw the relationship as having more understanding than it has in reality, because Vladimir Putin didn't take that interview too well, being called a killer. They've recalled their US ambassador, and the US continues to push hard on all of this with the threat of further sanctions. Here's the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki yesterday.
While we have announced key conclusions from an intelligence community assessment on the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, there's an ongoing review of other areas where we have ongoing concerns. At the same time, we have areas where we believe we can work together. Obviously, the signing of New START is an example of that. Addressing nuclear proliferation is an example of that. And we hope that there is opportunity there. But our relationship will look different. We will be direct. We will speak out on areas where we have concerns. And it will certainly be, and as the president said last night, certainly the Russians will be held accountable for the actions that they have taken. We'll have more on that soon.
Well, Russia might retaliate further. There's concerns, in fact, that they might pull out of the cozy OPEC Plus arrangement, of which Russia is the plus sign in all of that. That's where producers agree to limit the supply on oil to keep the prices higher than they would otherwise be. So we saw oil prices fall over 8% yesterday in one day. That's quite a move, although it's fair to say, even though the oil is now below $60 for WTI, $60 per barrel, it has spent most of this pandemic at or below $40. So it's still quite a bit higher than that. And of course, remember last year when it actually strangely went into negative territory? That was a sign that really things are not normal, are far from normal. When there was so much oil and we weren't using it that we were running out of places to store it. You know, you could have made a few extra quid by storing it in your bath, for example. Well, maybe we didn't get quite that far, but not far from it. So anyone who thought Biden was a soft touch, then think again. And he's not playing easy with China either. Senior officials are meeting from both sides right now, actually. There's not expected to be any resolution on tariffs and trade restrictions that Donald Trump, of course, put in place because of the intellectual property issues, but also because of human rights, including the end to democracy in Hong Kong, and also just on oil. Better watch Iran as well, because they're threatening to plow more oil into the markets as well. So as demand for oil increases, will OPEC be able to keep its stranglehold on prices, or will oil be cheaper? Which is good and bad, isn't it? Good in that it's going to keep a lid on any fears of inflation picking up, because oil is such a major contributor to inflation. Good for airlines, because obviously the cost of oil is a chunk of their operating cost, the cost of fuel. But maybe bad because it's going to increase oil usage, which is not going to be good for the planet. And on China, that meeting is underway between the US and China. It's got off to a frosty start, not just because they are meeting in Alaska, where it is cold, but it's pretty chilly in the meeting room as well. To try and sort out this new relationship between the US and China. The US Secretary of State Blinken has told Chinese officials that the US is committed to strengthening rules-based order, and that they are concerned about issues of Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and cyber attacks. And they reckon that Chinese actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability. What language is he speaking there, do you think? I think that is the language of diplomacy, where you can threaten, but you water the language down, so no one's really quite sure what you can say. China's foreign minister in return, Mr. Yang, has said that the US has many problems regarding human rights, and that the US uses military strength and financial supremacy to pressure countries, as well as abuses concepts of national security to threaten the future of international trade, and it incites some countries to attack China. Wow. No one's holding back in these talks, are they? He also said Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan are inseparable Chinese territories, and they oppose US interference in its internal affairs, and stated that the US does not represent the Western world nor global opinion, and is the champion of cyber attacks. Double wow. So, yeah, Joe Biden's new administration is not going to be soft on China. It seems. Watch all that one explode. That's it for today. Have a great weekend, if you can, after all of that. Try and forget about that. Just concentrate on what's important. Like, when are you going to open the first bottle of wine this weekend? I'm Phil Dobbie, back again on Monday morning.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthebusiness or wherever good